Julian Ginder.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise to speak on the Bright Line Test for Residential Land bill. The Green Party is supporting this bill, but we do have great misgivings as the legislation could be substantially better and have a greater impact in terms of reducing the problem of unaffordability in the Auckland housing market. And to that, I will be moving 2 amendments today to try and improve this legislation, and I'd like to speak to those SOPs more in detail, but I will start just by stating why it's important. Why is this bill important, or why is dealing with the Auckland housing crisis important? It is important because every New Zealander has a right to live in a warm, safe, secure, affordable home. Every child in New Zealand should have a warm, dry, secure, affordable place to call home. And that is increasingly out of reach of a number of low-income Aucklanders and people elsewhere in the country. We've had problems with housing unaffordability in Christchurch. And so for the Green Party, we know that we can't build a prosperous society if people don't have a place to call home. And it's of utmost importance that we prioritize that as a society. But there's a second reason why it's important, and that is the financial stability and economic stability, health of the country. The fact is that the Auckland house price crisis is a major risk to the financial stability of the country. And that is why the Reserve Bank in particular, and many others, have been very, very concerned about Auckland house prices. If we have a bubble and it collapses, there will be consequences for the New Zealand economy. It's quite possible that it would be enough to send us into a recession, even if our banks are solvent. There would be enormous economic repercussions. And of course, the faster house prices increase, the harder the fall when the bubble finally does pop. And of course, we know that many people have been asking the government to act on this issue for a number of years. The Green Party has been calling for leveling the playing field of property with other investments and other income through a capital gains tax since at least 2002, if not before that. We know that in 2010, Treasury pushed very hard for a comprehensive capital gains tax, and that was their preference. That a capital gains tax would still be our preference as a fair way to deal with it. If you earn income because one bought a house which then increased in value over a period of time. If that additional 100 grand or 200 grand, as may be the case in Auckland, why shouldn't one pay tax on that income just like nurses and doctors and builders and teachers pay tax on their income? It's only fair. But back in 2010, when Treasury pushed this government, the national government, hard to implement a capital gains tax, they also proposed a halfway house, a kind of compromise measure, which was the Bright Line test. And at that point, the Bright Line test was designed as being 5 years, which is the minimum amount holding period for the vast majority of OECD countries that have similar laws. And unfortunately, the legislation we have before us today is not 5 years, it's 2 years. And I will be moving an amendment to extend it to 5 years because, as we heard from submitters, a longer period would be much more effective at achieving the objectives, the stated objectives of the bill. And it is the norm in OECD countries. Of course, if National had actually acted on Treasury's advice back in 2010, we mightn't have the problem that we do today in quite the same extent. The average house price in Auckland in October 2010 was about $530,000. Now the average house price is $918,000 as of October 2015. So during the 5-year period where there was total inaction from this government, we had an increase of nearly 75% in the average house price in Auckland. That's almost $400,000 increase for each house. And of course, that change in value, if it's realized by people who are buying and selling properties during that period, all the money they earned on that will, of course, be completely tax-free. And so why wouldn't people invest in the housing market in Auckland? It's obviously the government is sending the signal through the tax treatment on property that that's where they should put their money, even though it means that it's harder for families to afford homes in Auckland, and it's a risk to the financial stability of the country. So I understand, Mr. Chair,
Julianne Genter.
I understand why people who have invested in homes may not want to pay tax on their income because currently they've got quite a sweet deal. But it's not what's in the interests of the country as a whole to not deal with this problem. So to the legislation before us today, I was very disappointed, and I think it's safe to say that virtually every submitter who came to talk to us was disappointed in the legislation as it was drafted. We simply didn't have enough time, even though the government has known about the problem and has been advised by Treasury to act on it for over 5 years. The legislation, when it finally came before the Select Committee, had a curtailed process. We had a shortened period for hearing from submitters. We had a number of questions that we put to officials, which they really did not have adequate time to address. And therefore, the legislation, I think, is really lacking and isn't the best it could be. We heard from a number of submitters that it's incredibly important that legislation, and particularly tax legislation, be coherent and consistent. And this bill does not meet that test. One way in which it doesn't meet the test is that supposedly the bill is meant to buttress the intentions test. The intentions test has a 10-year period and applies to all land. But this bill before us today, the Bright Line test for residential land, only applies to residential land. This is problematic in several respects. And a number of submitters stated this during the submissions, during the hearings in Select Committee. Firstly, it's difficult to define residential land. And this is going to be very problematic. And I'm not sure that those on the committee, particularly government members and officials, really understand just how difficult it's going to be to define land. Because within the bill, it refers to the zoning of the land as a test as to whether or not it could be residential. And the truth is that under the RMA, under pretty much any type of land, whether it's zoned industrial, commercial, mixed use, could be used for residential purposes if the applicant applies and gets a resource consent. So because of the way our resource management law works, it assumes that you can pretty much do whatever you want if you've got enough money and enough lawyers to apply for the resource consent and get it from the council, which is a pretty high bar, admittedly. But I think it's going to prove very problematic because there's a huge amount of land that is being land banked by speculators on the anticipation that eventually it will be available for residential use, but is currently not used for residential purposes, is currently farmland or industrial land on the outskirts of Auckland. And so I think we're going to have a problem with the definitions. And my proposal to solve that problem with the definitions is simply to stop having the distinction. Why would we want to have a distinction about residential land? It doesn't matter what the land is used for. It's simply clearer if it applies to all land. If there's not a problem with speculation in commercial, industrial, and farmland, then it's not going to be a problem. The intentions test applies to all land. Certainly, this legislation should apply to all land. And it removes a potential loophole by which we might suddenly other types of land might become a problem. Suddenly, because we've got the law only applying to residential land, there might be sudden demand for property speculation in any type of land that isn't residential, that is within the vicinity of Auckland, that's used for other purposes. And so I think that it would simply make it a much clearer piece of legislation. It would help better address the purpose of the bill and wouldn't create any loopholes. Certainly, I think we heard from most submitters that they agreed that it would make more sense if the bill was going to pass that it apply to all land equally, not just residential land. And then we no longer have this problem with definitions, because I really do think it's going to prove very, very difficult to isolate what is residential land and what isn't, because theoretically land use can change. It does change all the time, and particularly in fast-growing urban areas like Auckland. So my supplementary order paper today, which I would ask members of the House to consider voting for to improve the bill, is number 139. And what that does is it removes the references to residential land, so the bill applies to all land. The other supplementary order paper I'll be moving an amendment is number 138, and that's to extend the time frame from 2 years to 5 years. One of the criticisms we heard from submitters during, Mr. Chair?
The Honourable Phil Goff.